Frank and Dorothy Miller found themselves the unexpected proprietors of a revolution built from scrap lumber and defiance, all headquartered in a 10 by 20-foot corrugated steel box. They had become the quiet, unassuming sovereigns of a forgotten kingdom located at the end of a gravel road, a place called secure self-storage. From this metal throne, they had dismantled their children's betrayal, piece by meticulous piece, and built something new in its place. They had lost a 3-bedroom house with a garden, a reliable sedan, 50 years of accumulated memories, and a gold wedding band. In exchange, they had gained a fortress, a family forged in desperation, and a ledger book that held the power to ruin the two people they had once loved most in the world. It was a trade they never asked for, but one they had, in the end, accepted. But to understand how a retired carpenter and a former bookkeeper ended up living in Storage Unit B-17, you have to go back to the beginning, to the day their world shrank to the size of a single, vinyl-wrapped key card to a motel room they hadn't chosen. Their life before had been a study in quiet permanence. The house on Elm Street was more Frank and Dorothy than it was wood and plaster. Frank had built it himself, a wedding gift to his bride 52 years ago. He'd framed every wall, laid every floorboard, and hung every door. He knew the groan of the third step on the staircase and the precise spot on the porch where the morning sun landed first. Dorothy had filled that house with the scent of baking bread, the sound of children's laughter, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a well-kept home. She had managed the books for a local accounting firm for 40 years, her mind a fortress of numbers and balances. Together, they had raised 2 children, Mark and Susan, in that house. They had poured their lives into them, believing they were building a legacy, a foundation of love and support that would endure long after they were gone. They believed this right up until the day Mark and Susan sat them down at the familiar oak dining table, the one Frank had built from a tree that used to stand in the backyard. The children had spread a sheaf of papers across its polished surface. They used words like planning and security and Medicaid look-back period. They spoke of protecting the assets, of shielding the house from being taken by a nursing home should the worst happen. It was a conversation laced with love, or what sounded like it. Concern dripped from their voices like honey. "It's just a formality, Mom," Susan had said, her manicured hand resting gently on Dorothy's. "We're just putting the house in our names to protect it for you." And the power of attorney, Mark added, his voice smooth and reassuring, the same voice he used to sell software to skeptical corporations. "It just lets us handle the bills, manage things so you too can relax. You've earned it." Frank, a man who trusted the feel of a solid piece of wood more than the slippery nature of words, had looked at Dorothy. He saw the trust in her eyes, the love for the children she had raised. If Dorothy believed it was right, then it was right. She had always been the one who understood the paperwork, the fine print of life. He had simply built the world around them. So they signed. Dorothy's hand, steady from a lifetime of balancing ledgers, moved across the pages. Frank's larger, calloused hand followed, his signature a clumsy imitation of the elegant script his wife possessed. A week later, the children returned. This time, their voices were brighter, more excited. "We have a surprise for you," Susan announced. "A little vacation, a respite stay at a wonderful place. Just for a couple of weeks, while we get the house deep cleaned and do some minor repairs. A gift." They packed a single suitcase for them. They drove them in Frank's own car, the one he polished every Saturday. The wonderful place was the Starlight Motel, a low-slung building with a flickering neon sign on the edge of the highway. The air in the room was thick with the smell of stale smoke and disinfectant. "It's just temporary," Mark said, avoiding their eyes as he placed the suitcase on a luggage rack. "We'll be back in a few days to check on you." Before they left, Susan turned to her mother. "Mom, let me hold on to your rings for you, just for safekeeping. You wouldn't want to lose them here." She slid the engagement ring and the simple gold wedding band from Dorothy's finger. The skin beneath was pale, indented, a 52-year-old ghost of commitment. Dorothy felt a sudden, sharp pang of cold, but she said nothing. She watched her daughter drop the rings into her own pocket. "And the car keys, Dad?" Mark asked, his hand outstretched. We'll need to move it for the driveway resurfacing. Frank handed them over. The children hugged them. Their hugs felt thin, brittle. Then they were gone. The door clicked shut, leaving Frank and Dorothy standing in the middle of a room that was a universe away from their home. They stood there for a long time, the hum of the ancient air conditioner filling the silence. The worst hadn't happened yet. The worst was the slow, dawning realization over the next few days. The phone calls that went to voicemail. The texts that went unanswered. The single week of prepaid lodging that expired, forcing Dorothy to use their meager savings to pay for another. The third week was when the true devastation landed. Dorothy walked to the bank a mile down the highway to withdraw more cash. The teller, a young woman with a sympathetic but firm expression, slid a slip of paper back to her. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice low. "This account was closed 2 weeks ago. The funds were transferred out." Dorothy's blood ran cold. She felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Transferred. Closed. The words were alien, impossible. She explained the situation, the power of attorney. The teller's sympathy hardened into professional caution. "The transfer was initiated by Mark Miller, who has legal authority on this account. There's nothing we can do." She walked back to the motel in a daze. The sun beat down on the asphalt, but she felt nothing. She told Frank. He sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, his big hands hanging uselessly between his knees. He didn't speak. He just stared at the worn floral carpet, his shoulders slumped. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. He looked old. They were adrift. They tried calling the police. An officer came, listened with a weary patience, and then delivered the line that would become their refrain of despair. "It sounds like a civil matter. Your son has power of attorney. You'll need to hire a lawyer." Hire a lawyer. With what? The $57.16 in Dorothy's purse? They tried adult protective services. A harried-sounding woman on the phone took their information and promised someone would be in touch. No one ever was. They were invisible. They had been neatly and efficiently excised from their own lives by their own flesh and blood. Every system designed to protect them was locked shut, and their children held the keys. The days in the motel blurred into a monotonous cycle of fear and humiliation. They ate crackers and canned soup heated in the room's grimy microwave. They watched daytime television with the sound off. They lay awake at night, listening to the sounds of the highway, the roar of trucks, a constant reminder of a world that was moving on without them. The money dwindled. $40, $20, $10. The motel manager started knocking on their door in the mornings, his expression growing more impatient each day. This was the low point. This was the bottom. Frank had retreated into a shell of silence. He spent hours staring out the window, his face a mask of stony grief. He had built a life, and it had been stolen from him. The tools of his trade, his hands, were now just things that trembled when he tried to lift a cup of coffee. He was a builder with nothing left to build. Dorothy, however, was a bookkeeper. Her mind was not built for passivity. It was built to find errors, to reconcile accounts, to make things add up. And this situation did not add up. It was a monstrous, gaping imbalance in the ledger of their lives. She refused to let it stand. But refusal was not a plan. Hope was a resource more scarce than money. It was on their last night at the motel, with eviction looming the next morning, that she found it. She was cleaning out her purse, a pointless, methodical act of tidying up the wreckage. She dumped its contents onto the stained bedspread. Old tissues, a tube of lipstick, a pen that didn't work, a handful of coins, and a small, folded piece of paper. A receipt. She unfolded it. Secure self-storage. Unit B, 17. Paid in full for 1 year. The payment had been made 6 months ago. She remembered now. After her own mother had passed, she couldn't bear to part with her parents' old bedroom set, the heavy mahogany furniture that smelled of lemon polish and time. Frank had grumbled about the expense, but he'd helped her move it into the unit, along with boxes of old photographs, her father's tools, and other sentimental artifacts they had no room for in the house. The lease was in her name only. Dorothy Miller. An automatic payment from their now-defunct savings account. It was a loose end, a detail her meticulously efficient children had overlooked. She stared at the receipt. The address was on the other side of town. Unit B, 17. 10 feet wide, 20 feet deep. A metal box. It was nothing. It was everything. A spark ignited in the cold, dead space of her chest. It was a tiny, fragile thing, but it was there. She looked over at Frank, who was sitting in his usual spot by the window, a silent statue of a man. "Frank," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He didn't turn. "Frank, I have an idea." He finally looked at her, his eyes hollow. "What, Dottie? What idea can possibly matter now?" She held up the receipt. "We have a place." He squinted at the paper, then shook his head, a bitter, humorless smile touching his lips. "A storage unit? That's your idea? It's a 10 by 20 metal box, Dottie. It's not a home." "No," she agreed, her voice gaining strength. "It's not, but it's paid for. It's ours. It's a start." He stared at her, at the fierce, unfamiliar light in her eyes. For weeks, he had been drowning, and she had been drowning beside him. Now, she was offering him a piece of driftwood. It wasn't a life raft, but it was something to cling to. He saw the bookkeeper in her, the woman who could find a single misplaced cent in a mountain of paperwork. She had found their last remaining asset. "How do we get there?" he asked, the first practical question he had uttered in a month. "With the last of our money," she said, pointing to the $9 and change on the bedspread. "We'll take a bus." The decision was made. There was no debate, no weighing of options. There was only this one, desperate, illogical path forward. They packed their few belongings back into the single suitcase. The next morning, they left the key card on the front desk of the Starlight Motel and walked out into the pale morning light. They didn't look back. They walked to the bus stop on the highway, two elderly people with one suitcase, and waited. When the bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes, Dorothy paid their fare. The coins clattered into the machine, a final, definitive sound. It was the sound of them cashing in the last remnants of their old life to buy a ticket to an unknown future. The bus ride was long and bumpy. They didn't speak. Frank stared out the window at the passing landscape of strip malls and gas stations. Dorothy clutched her purse in her lap, the storage unit key inside a small pocket. It felt impossibly heavy, like the key to a dungeon or a kingdom. She wasn't sure which. Secure Self-Storage was a sprawling complex of identical, single-story buildings painted a faded, anonymous beige. Rows and rows of orange metal doors stretched out under the relentless sun. It was a place designed for things, not people. A library of forgotten possessions. The manager was a bored-looking man in a small office who barely glanced at them. He checked Dorothy's ID, handed her a gate code, and pointed them in the direction of Building B. They found B-17 at the end of a long, silent corridor of steel. The air was still and smelled of dust and hot metal. Frank stood before the roll-up door, his shoulders squared. This was a physical object, a problem he could understand. Dorothy handed him the key. He unlocked the heavy-duty padlock, the click echoing in the silence. Then, with a grunt of effort, he slid the heavy door upward. It rattled and screeched in protest, revealing the dark, cavernous space within. A wave of cool, musty air washed over them. The contents of the unit were just as they had left them, shrouded in white sheets like ghosts. For a moment, they just stood there, peering into the darkness. It was a tomb filled with the artifacts of a dead life. Her mother's mahogany bed frame, disassembled and leaning against a wall. A tall, imposing wardrobe. Boxes stacked high, labeled in Dorothy's neat print. Photos, kitchen, grandma's china, Frank's old journals. Frank was the first to step inside. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool wood of the wardrobe. He picked up a box labeled Tools Dad's. He opened it. Inside, nestled in oiled cloth, were his father's old hand planes, chisels, and saws. Tools from a time when things were made to last. He lifted a heavy wooden mallet, its head worn smooth from a lifetime of use. He balanced it in his palm. Dorothy watched him. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a light that had been extinguished for weeks. It was the look of a man rediscovering a part of himself he thought was lost forever. The builder had found his tools. "It's against the rules to live here," Frank said, his voice raspy. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the space, assessing it. His eyes measured the height of the ceiling, the width of the walls. "We have no choice," Dorothy replied. "We'll be careful. We'll be quiet." That first night was miserable. They slept on a dusty, old mattress from a guest room they no longer had. They had no light, no water, no heat. The metal door was rolled down, plunging them into absolute darkness. The silence was immense, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. It was cold. Dorothy lay awake, listening to the distant rumble of a train, feeling a profound and terrifying sense of dislocation. They were trespassers in their own last refuge. But when the sun came up, casting thin lines of light under the crack of the door, something shifted. The darkness receded. Frank was already up. He had found an old battery-powered lantern in one of the boxes. In its pale glow, he was working. He had cleared a space in the back of the unit. He was using the disassembled bed frame and other pieces of scrap wood to partition off a small area. He was creating a room within a room. He was building. "We need supplies," he said, his voice full of a purpose she hadn't heard in years. "Dwight, more batteries, screws, a small butane stove." "We have no money," she reminded him gently. "We have this," he said, holding up his father's antique hand plane. "And these," he gestured to the other tools. "Some of these are valuable. We could sell 1 inch." Dorothy's heart ached at the thought. Those were his inheritance, his connection to his own father. "No," she said, "not yet. Let's try something else first." She remembered a place from their old neighborhood, an independent hardware store called Hobbs Hardware. It was run by a man their age, Earl Hobbs, a gruff but fair man who Frank had done business with for decades. It was a long walk, but was their only option. They made the 2-mile trek to the store. It was a place that smelled of sawdust, metal, and fertilizer, a scent that was like a tonic to Frank. Earl was behind the counter, a stout man with a fringe of white hair and glasses perched on the end of his nose. He recognized Frank immediately. "Frank Miller," he said, his eyes crinkling. "Haven't seen you in a dog's age. Heard you sold the house." The small-town gossip mill had evidently been grinding away. Frank's face tightened. Dorothy stepped forward. "Earl," she said, her voice even, "we're in a bit of a bind. We need some supplies." She didn't tell him the whole story. She didn't have to. Earl was a man who had seen his share of life's hardships. He looked at them, truly looked at them. He saw their worn clothes, the deep lines of stress on their faces, the desperate hope in their eyes. He saw the way Frank's hands instinctively stroked a display of new hammers, a musician caressing a lost instrument. Frank laid out a small, precise list on the counter. Wire, a battery terminal, insulation foam, a small camping stove. He explained what he was trying to build, a small, insulated sleeping area in a workshop he was setting up. He didn't say where the workshop was. Earl looked at the list. He looked at Frank. He looked at Dorothy. He tapped a pencil on the counter for a long, silent moment. Then he sighed. "All right, Frank," he said, "let's set you up an account. Pay me when you can." It wasn't charity. It was an act of professional solidarity, a vote of confidence from one old-timer to another. It was the first act of grace they had been shown in months. Dorothy felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost brought her to her knees. She just nodded, unable to speak. They walked back to the storage unit with their supplies, their steps lighter than they had been in weeks. They had a project. They had a benefactor. They had a chance. That day, Frank went to work with a fervor that was breathtaking. He was no longer a broken old man. He was a craftsman. He insulated the small partitioned space, creating a cozy, protected alcove. He wired the batteries to a series of small LED lights, flooding their metal box with clean, bright light. He set up the small stove, and for the first time in weeks, they had a hot meal that wasn't from microwave. It was canned stew, but it tasted like a feast. While Frank built their physical shelter, Dorothy began to build their arsenal. She had found a box of old ledgers from her office days, their pages crisp and empty. With a pen she'd bought at a dollar store, she began to write. She started a new account book. On the first page, in her perfect, steady script, she wrote, "The matter of Mark and Susan Miller." She documented everything. The date they signed the papers. The conversation, as she remembered it, word for word. The day they were taken to the motel. The value of the house. The amount of money in their bank account. Every unanswered phone call. Every dismissive official. She created a timeline, a balance sheet of their stolen life. It was a meticulous accounting of betrayal. Every entry was a brick in the wall of the case she was building against her own children. This was her trade, her craft. Frank built with wood and wire. She built with facts and figures. Life in Unit B. 17 fell into a strange, secret rhythm. They rose with the sun, careful not to make noise until the facility officially opened for the day. They spent their days inside, the door shut, living by the glow of Frank's LED lights. Frank tinkered, organized, and improved their small space. He built shelves, a small table, 2 comfortable chairs. He used every scrap of wood, every forgotten screw. He was turning their metal tomb into a surprisingly functional home. Dorothy managed their existence. She kept the ledger. She devised a system for groceries, making quick, efficient trips to a nearby discount store. They used the public restroom at a park a half-mile away. It was a life of careful planning and constant, low-level fear of discovery. But it was a life they controlled. For the first time since their children had driven them away, they had agency. One afternoon, Dorothy was returning from grocery run when she noticed the door to the unit next to theirs was ajar. A young woman with tired eyes and a smudge of grease on her cheek was struggling with the engine of a battered old car she had somehow crammed inside. The young woman, who looked to be in her early 20s, swore under her breath and kicked the tire. Dorothy hesitated. Their survival depended on anonymity. But she saw the same desperation in the girl's eyes that she saw in the mirror every morning. She walked over. "Trouble?" she asked. The young woman started, looking up with wary eyes. "Just a dead alternator," she muttered, "and a world of other problems." "My husband is good with engines," Dorothy said, making a split-second decision. "He's a carpenter, but he can fix anything." That was how they met Chloe. She, too, was living in her unit. She had been kicked out of her family home after an argument, and with nowhere else to go, she had moved into the only space she could afford. She worked a dead-end job at a coffee shop and was trying to save enough money to get a real apartment. Frank came over, looked at the engine, and within an hour had diagnosed the problem and figured out a way to bypass it temporarily. Chloe stared at him with something akin to hero worship. That evening, she knocked on their door with a small bag containing 2 hot coffees and a pastry. It was a peace offering, an act of gratitude. They let her in. Her eyes widened as she saw their setup. The partitioned room, the lights, the neat shelves. "Wow," she breathed. "You guys have a palace." An unlikely friendship was born in that corridor of steel boxes. Chloe became their legs and their eyes to the outside world. She would pick up groceries for them, run errands, and warn them if the manager was making his rounds. In return, Frank became the father figure she'd never really had. He helped her fix her car properly, built her a sturdy bed frame for her own unit, and taught her how to use a few basic tools. Dorothy would listen to her stories, offering quiet advice and the simple comfort of a maternal presence. They were a strange, secret family. The retired carpenter, the former bookkeeper, and the cast-off barista. They were the forgotten people, living in the cracks of society, and they had found each other. Dorothy started a new page in her ledger, a budget for their small community of 3. They pooled their resources. Chloe's small income, combined with the occasional cash Frank earned by doing small repair jobs for other tenants who didn't ask too many questions, was enough to sustain them. They were building a new ecosystem, a microeconomy born of sheer desperation. But their fragile world was always one discovery away from collapse. The threat arrived in the form of a white envelope taped to their door. It was from the facility management. A notice. A routine inspection of all units was scheduled for the end of the month. Below that, a stark reminder in bold type. Living in or habitation of storage units is strictly prohibited and is grounds for immediate eviction. The words hit them like a physical blow. Eviction. The word tasted like ash. It meant the motel, it meant the street, It meant the end of their fragile independence. Frank stared at the notice, his face grim. "It's over," he said quietly. "We had a good run." Chloe was distraught. But Dorothy, the bookkeeper, the strategist, was not ready to concede. She looked at the notice not as a death sentence, but as a problem to be solved, an account to be balanced. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "It's not over. We have 30 days." She called a meeting in their unit. The three of them sat around the small table Frank had built. "We have two options," Dorothy began, her voice calm and methodical. "We can run, or we can fight. If we run, we lose everything. If we fight, we might still lose, but we have a chance." "Fight how?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling. "They own the place. They make the rules. We change the narrative," Dorothy said. "We don't let them see us as vagrants. We let them see us as tenants with a problem they can help solve." The plan she laid out was audacious. It was born of desperation, but it was also rooted in a lifetime of practical knowledge. They wouldn't just clean out their unit. They would transform it. They would show the management not a problem, but a solution. The next few weeks were a flurry of controlled, frantic activity. Earl Hobbs, their hardware store benefactor, became a key part of their conspiracy. When Dorothy explained their predicament, he didn't scold them. He just nodded grimly. "That tracks," he said. "People getting squeezed out everywhere." He extended their line of credit further. He gave them advice on portable sinks and chemical toilets that would meet certain code standards. He became their silent partner. Frank worked like a man half his age. He took down the crude partition and built a proper, framed wall. He installed a small, self-contained plumbing system for a tiny sink, using a marine-grade water pump. He built a Murphy bed that could fold up against the wall, making the space look like a workshop during the day. He installed smoke detectors and a fire extinguisher. He was turning their illegal home into a model of efficient, safe micro-living. Chloe, meanwhile, put her own skills to use. Her cousin was a paralegal. She couldn't offer legal representation, but she could provide information. She spent hours at the library, printing out local housing codes, tenancy laws, and precedents for unconventional living situations. She compiled a folder of research for Dorothy. Dorothy was the general, overseeing the entire operation. She managed the budget, sourced materials, and continued to build her other case, the one against her children. The two projects felt connected, two fronts in the same war for their dignity. As the inspection day drew closer, their secret community was threatened from another direction. A sleek, expensive car pulled into the storage facility, a vehicle so out of place it was like a spaceship landing in a junkyard. It was Susan. She had found them. How? I didn't know. Probably by tracking Dorothy's use of a discount grocery card, a detail Dorothy cursed herself for overlooking. Susan got out of the car, her face a mask of pinched disgust as she looked at the rows of metal doors. She found B, 17, and knocked sharply. Frank opened the door. His face went rigid. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I need to talk to Mom," Susan said, trying to peer past him into the unit. "It's important." Dorothy came to the door. She looked at her daughter, at her expensive clothes, and her perfectly styled hair. She felt nothing. The space where love had once been was now a cold, hard knot of resolve. "What is it, Susan?" "I need you to sign something," Susan said, pulling a document from her designer handbag. "The buyers for the house are getting antsy. We need to finalize the sale, and as a pension form, they need your signature on to release the funds." She was there for money. Of course she was. She glanced inside, her eyes widening in horror at the sight of their living space. "My God," she whispered. "You're living in here? This is mortifying. What will people think?" That was the question that broke the dam of Dorothy's composure. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "How did this happen?" But, "What will people think?" Dorothy stepped out into the sunlight, pulling the door shut behind her. She faced her daughter. "I'm no longer concerned with what people think, Susan," she said, her voice quiet and deadly serious. "I am concerned with what a judge will think." She walked back into the unit and returned with her ledger. She opened it and held it up for Susan to see. The pages of neat, damning columns. The timeline of their betrayal. The accounting of every stolen dollar. This is what I think about, Dorothy said. I have documented every phone call you and your brother ignored. Every dollar you took. Every lie you told. When you sell that house, you will be selling stolen property. When you access that pension, you will be committing fraud. And I will be submitting this ledger, along with a full report, to the district attorney's office. Susan's face went pale. The condescending pity in her eyes was replaced by a flash of genuine fear. She had always seen her parents as gentle, pliable, and ultimately weak. She was not prepared for this. She was not prepared for her mother, the quiet bookkeeper, to have become a meticulous and patient predator. You wouldn't, Susan stammered. We're your family. You stopped being our family the day you left us at the Starlight Motel, Dorothy said, her voice unwavering. Now, I suggest you leave. You are trespassing. Susan stared at her for a moment longer, then crumpled. She got back in her expensive car and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. The confrontation had been terrifying, but it was also electrifying. They had faced one of their tormentors and had not flinched. They had won. The day of the inspection arrived. The manager, a man named Henderson, arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by a uniformed sheriff's deputy. This was worse than they had feared. The presence of law enforcement meant this was not a simple lease violation check. This was an eviction. Frank and Dorothy stood before their open unit. Chloe was next door, watching anxiously. They had done everything they could. The Murphy bed was folded away. The space was clean, organized, looking for all the world like an obsessive carpenter's workshop. Henderson walked in, his clipboard at the ready, his expression stern. The deputy followed, his hand resting near his sidearm. They were expecting to find a squalid, dangerous mess. They stopped just inside the door, their eyes adjusting to the light. They looked around, and their expressions shifted from sternness to confusion. Frank's workmanship was undeniable. The walls were solid. The wiring for the lights was neat and secure. The small sink was clean. It was unconventional, but it was not squalid. It was impressive. What is all this? Henderson asked, gesturing vaguely at the setup. This, Dorothy said, stepping forward, is a proposal. She handed him a folder. It was not the Ledger of Betrayal. It was a different book altogether. Inside was a detailed business plan. A proposal to convert a small number of unused units into code-compliant, low-cost micro-residences. It included budget projections, potential rental income, liability waivers, and a list of safety features, all of which were already implemented in their own unit as a proof of concept. She had used Chloe's research and her own 4 decades of accounting experience to create a document that was as professional and thorough as any he had ever seen. Henderson stared at the folder, then back at Dorothy. He was speechless. The deputy, a man in his late 40s with a weary but intelligent face, walked deeper into the unit. He tapped on the wall Frank had built. He examined the battery setup. He looked at Frank and Dorothy, at their clean clothes and their dignified expressions. He had seen elder abuse cases before. He had seen the broken, defeated victims. These people were not that. We know we broke the rules, Dorothy said, her voice steady. We did it to survive. But in doing so, we think we've found a solution to a bigger problem. There are other people like us, people who have nowhere to go. This could be a safe, affordable option for them. The deputy turned to her. Ma'am, why are you living here? What happened? This was the moment. Dorothy took a deep breath and handed him a second folder. This one was a slimmed-down version of her ledger. A concise 2-page summary of the financial fraud, the theft, the abandonment. It was clear, factual, and devastating. The deputy read it. He read it again. His weary expression hardened into a cold, professional anger. He looked from the paper to Dorothy, then to Frank. Did you file a police report? He asked. We tried, Frank said, his voice rough. They told us it was a civil matter. The deputy shook his head slowly. No, he said. This is felony financial elder abuse. And theft. And fraud. He pulled out his phone. I know the head of the elder abuse unit at the DA's office. I'm calling him right now. You shouldn't have been dismissed like this. Henderson, the manager, was watching this all unfold, his mind racing. He had a choice. He could be the heartless landlord who evicted a pair of elderly victims, a story that would look terrible on the 6 o'clock news. Or he could be the innovative business owner who helped create a solution. He looked at Dorothy's proposal again. The numbers made sense. "I'm not evicting you today," he said, his voice holding a new note of respect. "I'm giving you a 60-day extension. I'm going to take this proposal to the owners. No promises, but I'll take it to them." It was a victory beyond their wildest dreams. They hadn't just survived. They had been seen. They had been heard. The system that had been a locked door was suddenly cracking open, pushed by the simple integrity of a deputy who cared and the undeniable logic of Dorothy's numbers. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The district attorney's office launched a full-scale investigation, with Dorothy's ledger as its roadmap. An investigator spent hours with her, marveling at the precision of her records. The house sale was frozen by a court order. Mark and Susan's bank accounts were subpoenaed and then frozen. They were arrested and charged. The story, inevitably, leaked to the press. A local reporter wrote a feature story. Betrayed by their children, elderly couple builds a new life in a storage unit. It was picked up by the national news wires. Their quiet, desperate fight for survival became a public cause. Donations poured in. A local construction company offered to supply materials for free. A nonprofit that specialized in housing solutions offered to partner with the storage facility's owners. Henderson's bosses, seeing a PR goldmine and a genuinely viable business model, enthusiastically approved Dorothy's pilot program. Unit B-17 became the headquarters for the Secure Start Project. Frank, no longer just a survivor, but a foreman, led a team of volunteers, many of them young people who had been homeless themselves. He taught them his trade, his hands sure and steady as he showed them how to frame a wall, wire a light, and hang a door. He was building again, not just for himself, but for a whole community of forgotten people. Dorothy managed the entire project. She ran the books, coordinated with the nonprofit, interviewed potential residents, and ensured that every dollar was accounted for. She created a system that was not about charity, but about dignity and a hand up. Residents paid a small, affordable rent and contributed to the community's upkeep. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem built on the principles of mutual respect and shared responsibility. They never moved back to the house on Elm Street. When the legal proceedings were over and the house was returned to their name, they sold it immediately. The memories were too poisoned. The money from the sale was used to fund the expansion of the Secure Start Project. They chose to stay in their converted unit, the heart of the community they had built. It was more of a home than the old house had ever been. One day, months later, a thin, haggard-looking man appeared at the entrance to their unit. It was Mark. The legal battle had broken him. He had lost his job, his reputation, his freedom pending the trial. He looked lost and ashamed. He tried to apologize. The words came out in a stumbling, incoherent rush of excuses and regrets. Dorothy listened patiently. When he was finished, she didn't offer forgiveness or condemnation. She simply looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. "We need help sorting and stacking the lumber delivery," she said. "Frank's back is bothering him today." It was not absolution. It was an invitation to work, a chance to start rebuilding, not with words, but with deeds, to pay off a debt that could never truly be repaid. Mark hesitated, then nodded, tears welling in his eyes. He spent the rest of the day working alongside the other volunteers, his soft office hands quickly becoming raw and blistered. It was a start. Susan never came. She took a plea deal that involved a long period of probation and restitution, and then she disappeared from their lives forever. Months turned into a year. The Secure Start Project thrived. 10 units were converted, then 20. A small community garden was planted in a patch of unused land behind Building C. Chloe was now the on-site manager, her life turned around by the purpose and stability she had found. One evening, Frank and Dorothy sat on the small porch he had built outside their unit. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over their strange and wonderful kingdom. The air smelled of blooming tomato plants from the garden and fresh-cut sawdust. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a simple, polished band of stainless steel, made from a large nut he had found and painstakingly sanded and polished until it shone like silver. He took Dorothy's hand, the skin still pale where her old ring had been, and slid it onto her finger. It was cool and solid, a perfect fit. She looked at him, her eyes shining. They didn't need to say anything. They had lost a life built of wood and plaster and gold, and in its place, they had built a world out of steel and kindness and second chances. He held her hand, his calloused fingers intertwined with hers, and they watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon. The small electric light on their porch flickered on, a quiet promise in the gathering darkness. It would stay on all night,